This is the Gospel of John, based on a Navigators publication, John, Lifechange Book 20 by NavPress. Welcome to Part C of the Introduction to John's Gospel, Lesson 1. We're still focusing on why we should trust John's Gospel as Scripture, but taking it from a different angle. We're going to be learning what a Christian gospel actually is, what are the ingredients of it, and then from that being able to try to see if we can recognize them. We're going to touch on question 5. We've pretty much answered that already, but we're going to focus on questions 3, 6, 7, 8, and 9. You might want to look those over in your book before you actually meet in group and be ready. So let's talk about what we're actually doing. Have you ever had somebody ask you or make a statement and have the argument whether or not Die Hard is a Christmas movie? Well, how can they do that? Well, because Christmas movies are a motif, a genre of movie. They have certain ingredients that you have to expect. And so we can look at anything and say, does it meet that genre? Um, we talked about in the last video comic books like superhero comic books. They have certain agreements, certain things that they do. There's usually a secret identity because a superhero has to be able to hide amongst the population. There's some supernatural thing or extraordinary event that's given them a superpower. There's a sort of Achilles heel, the kryptonite of Superman. Those are all ingredients of that motif. We can do the same thing when it comes to Christian gospels. Recognize which ones are and which ones weren't, and understand how then the church decided to pick and choose from those. What we're talking about is identifying scripture. We've already been talking about that some. So I want to talk about it first from the standpoint of scripture generally, and then that'll help us to distinguish between scripture generally and the gospel motif, which we're going to talk about later. So I want you to think about what we've talked about in part A and part B, put them together in your mind, and then independently, before we get together as a group, think about and write down all the things that you think we've decided or maybe sort of hinted that a scripture would need to have. I'll give you the first one as an example and then let you come back. And I'm going to tell you, I came up with 11. So the first one, that's the easiest one, is to say that scripture has to come from an apostle. Remember, we talked about apostolicity, very hard word to say, but an easy one to understand. And so think about that and spin from there on all the things we've talked about and see if you can get outside the box some. Pause the video now and we'll come back to it. There's your drum roll again. Are you ready? All right, I'm going to give my answers. And remember, this is not a fixed scientific list. It's just the things that I know about. People will argue it from different angles on how the church historically did it, but they're all certainly talked about and discussed by church fathers in one degree or another. So, since we know scripture has to come from an apostle, the second one kind of makes sense. An apostle has to be defined as somebody who was an eyewitness to Jesus. And we'll see this when they're actually selecting people to replace apostles. Apostolicity has to do with somebody who was an eyewitness to Jesus. The furthest exception from this is really Paul, who never met Jesus in person, but he met Jesus in a vision, and that vision was affirmed by the apostles in the Jerusalem council. They said, yeah, this guy, he knows Jesus. So the church doesn't pass apostolicity from the Protestant viewpoint down from person to person, almost like a genetic inheritance thing or a blessing. It's more that the church verifies Jesus selecting an apostle. That's the Protestant viewpoint, and we'll talk some at some point in time, probably about the Catholic view and the Eastern Orthodox or the Orthodox view, which varies a little bit. So, but I do want to say, even with the Catholics and the Orthodox, they agree that Scripture is closed. So, an apostle, from a standpoint of an office in the church, may not be need to be that, but an apostle, from a gospel writing standpoint, has to be personally picked by Jesus. So, if an apostle wrote it, then it was written during the apostle's lifetime. Wasn't written a century later by somebody who said that they had a visit from the apostle or suddenly found a document that nobody had ever seen before. There should be lots of fragmentary copies of that, is that this is true, because of the fact that the church copies scripture. So when the church considers scripture to be important and copies it, there should be lots of pieces. Parchment uh, and papyrus goes away. It all scrolls. They basically deteriorate, but they deteriorate typically from the outside or in like sunspots, depending on what's exposed. It's not like when you used to run copies of things with that blue ink that you could smell on things, that I forget what they called them, where you ran off copies and all of a sudden all the ink would fade on the page. So we find fragments, things that are the Gospel of John through the years that verify, yeah, the church copied this, they used it. And this is actually, these two actually play in. There should be evidence of the church regarding the scripture, not just in the fragmentary copies, but even in mentions. We should see churches referencing the book written by John that's a gospel, the letters that John did, and referencing them in ways that evidence they were regarded as scripture. It should show indirect autographing, particularly in New Testament times during persecution. I'm not saying that it cannot say in it a letter from Paul, a letter from Peter. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that it should also include these indirect things where they're verifying who they are, using people that the church knew and referencing them. Particularly, remember, during the persecution years under Nero and other emperors who persecuted. Uh, they shouldn't necessarily depend on the most well-known writer. One of the reasons why Mark and Luke are regarded as apostolistic is because they were the writers for Peter and Paul. They wrote gospels that they would have charged them to do, so they were blessed. But they're not the kind of people that anybody would fake things with. Um, so there's that. They're not big important people in the church. It can't be a writer opposed to Jesus. If Judas Iscariot said he wrote a gospel of Jesus, even if he wrote it, I wouldn't consider it trustworthy. Same with Caiaphas, same with Pontius Pilate, those kinds of people. They have to be people that Jesus validated as apostles and that remain true to Jesus, not just through their lifetime, not just through his. And I mean his lifetime on earth. I want to be clear about that. The writing has to be purposeful, and the purpose is usually identified. So you'll see even in the letters, Peter and Paul and John talking about why they're writing something, what their intention is, and then you'll see them behaving in the letter consistent with that, not just saying things that can be used for doctrinal support, but literally trying to address a particular issue or clarify something, as John says, trying to create some belief in somebody that these things really happened. The letters often reference each other. This isn't a requirement, but it's very helpful. You'll see some letters actually refer to the letter to Laodicea, which we believe is the letter to the Ephesians. You'll see where Peter says all Paul's letters are scripture, even when he doesn't understand them. So we see this network of the gospel or the scriptures reaffirming each other in that sense. The fact that Matthew and in some cases Luke are synoptic, meaning that they use material that Mark probably wrote. Most people think that Mark wrote first. That's not definite, but we think that. That's an indication that they were trying to be true to the original story, so they are attesting to each other in that regard. And we should see the writer being intentional and having a purpose that the content affirms, right? And so not just that he says there is a purpose, but actually that the content in it reaffirms that purpose. So those are my 11. Some of them are very close to each other. You might have come up with more of that or less. I just wanted you to think about how we know how the church went about saying, yeah, I'm pretty sure this was John and he wrote this gospel. And in the time of John, you can see that the fathers actually are affirming people that probably knew John, saying, yeah, John wrote this. Let's do a roadmap check real quick. So, just a reminder, I'm doing these roadmap checks periodically so that you know where we're headed. That way, when I'm talking about something, you don't wander into thinking about something else as easily. You can stay focused on understanding why I'm talking about what I'm talking about, where we're going. You don't take side streets mentally. So, that's the purpose. We're going to talk mostly about what a Christian gospel is. So not just the word, it means good news, but how that affects everything. Specifically, what is good news? Can you have just anything that's good news and consider it a gospel? We're going to talk about what the word synoptic means and what a synoptic gospel is, why John's is not a synoptic gospel. We're going to talk about ways to recognize when a gospel is not a real gospel or not a real Christian gospel. The reason is I want when somebody says, I was watching the History Channel last night, and did you know there was a gospel that they didn't include in the Bible that somebody found and it totally changes who Jesus is? I want you to have a good, solid answer on that. And it's really not that hard. And then I want to give you examples of fake gospels so you can see just how far fetched some of these have gotten through the years. And then finally, we're going to talk about the theme of misunderstanding that's in the book of John, and that is the Gospel of John, that is talked about in the book and why it's important. So let's press on. Gospels are only one of many formats of writing in the New Testament. We will discuss four to allow comparison. The second were instructional letters dealing with the behavior of people in the church and interpretation of the Hebrew scriptures in light of Jesus on the cross. These are called epistles, and we already showed you some examples of this. The word literally means letters, and they are generally claimed by the person who composes them, though they're often dictated to and written by a ghostwriter. Paul dictated mostly to Luke. Peter dictated mostly to Mark. The book of Acts records Mark and Luke as Paul and Peter's traveling companions, validating what I just said historically. John generally wrote for himself above arguments that he did not write this gospel aside, as did Matthew. The book of Acts forms the only book in the New Testament of the third type, history. It is written by Luke and documents the growth of the early church, first in Jerusalem, then as Paul and the other apostles take the gospel to the rest of the known world. Acts is important to understand the epistles and the time frame and events going on as the epistles are written. One of the reasons to accept the epistles as authentic is that the history in Acts corresponds to and supports them when we combine it to Roman sources and other documents of actual people in history. The more we learn about history outside the Bible, the more historicity of the book of Acts and the authorship of the epistles is affirmed. In fact, Gary Habermas, a highly esteemed biblical historian, says that because of this and other factors, Paul's letters in the Bible are some of the most historically affirmed literature, even among non Christian historians. The last type of writing or literature is apocalyptic, which we should not confuse with apocryphal. Apocryphal means questionable, while apocalyptic are a genre of works that use symbolic visions, imagery, and prophetic language to reveal hidden truths about God's activity in history, especially concerning the end times. The book of Revelations is our only example of a book entirely committed to this genre in the New Testament. Though some would argue that the letters to the Thessalonians shadow that, in that they refer to Paul's teachings about the same thing, likely verbal teachings. These can be seen as a variation on prophetic books in the Old Testament, like Daniel, except that these speak of the end of the story overall as opposed to just the restoration of Israel. We are dealing here with the first type of literature called Gospels. Unlike the letters in history, Gospels were a new genre of biographical writing specific to Christians. Because there were no rules or traditions as to what a gospel should look like, early on, any writer could write anything and define it as good news, which is the meaning of the word gospel, and pawn it off as a Christian gospel. And many authors tried to hijack the message of Jesus by claiming they found a new lost gospel from one of the apostles through the years. We should be able to see when we read the four gospels together uh, that unlike the fakes, the gospels absolutely agree on what the actual good news they are bringing is. John's Gospel in chapter 1 through 18, defines very clearly what that good news is. Let's read it now and think about these two questions. If John were here today and we just read 1 John 1 through 18 and then asked John, what are you calling good news and why? How do you think he would respond? And then, two, given that, and assuming the other gospels see the good news the same way, what should be the main topic of any gospel? Pause the video now and discuss this. There's your drum roll. That's letting you know that I'm about to give you my answers. So I hope you've finished sharing yours. A Christian gospel is a new form of biography telling us why Jesus is coming or why he came, and why that's good news. By talking about what he did, what he said, the good news should point to the cross. It talks about how the cross fulfills the curse of the law on God's people. In other words, it should be a story about how Jesus made the way for us to be restored to God through the cross. That's what we see the entire content of all four Gospels doing and agreeing on. The Gospels are kind of divided into two groups, synoptic and non synoptic. Synoptic mean that they seem to have used kind of the same core source. They're in relative agreement with regard to the content and delivery. Some details do vary because they are eyewitness testimonies. Peter is likely Mark's source. Although the book is attributed to Mark, it's likely functioning as a sort of gospel of Peter through Mark. Matthew was an eyewitness himself, as was John, but he may have consulted Peter's work through Mark, or it appears that he may have. Luke kind of pulled everybody's gospels together, making his a synoptic also. He very specifically says that he's writing because other people have tried to make an orderly account, and he's trying to make one that brings everybody's together. John's, though, is the one that is called a non synoptic, and that's why it's important. Um, the there are several traits that we can say that should always belong in a Christian gospel. So let's talk about those now. First, they must be written by an eyewitness or somebody with direct access to a witness. That's a characteristic of a Christian gospel. They are written during the lifespan of the eyewitness so that they can be verified. The church would require that. They use parables taught by Jesus and the events of his life to tell the good news as opposed to being poetry, history alone, or wisdom. And it has to be the right good news. They have to teach the same message about who Jesus is, why he came, and how the good news, as previously affirmed in the Gospels, uh, holds. In other words, they have to be consistent with the other Gospels. Finally, they should be witnessed and attested to as used in the first or century church by a church father. Somebody should have mentioned this book. There's another one that some people might argue, but they should also be historical. All of the Bible's gospels are supported by real history. They're about real places, real people, and real events, even though they sometimes mention Jesus using parables. They're set in real history. Fake books avoid setting themselves in real history because if they get something wrong, they can be refuted, and they're often written by people who were never actually there. Thus, the rejected books called non canonical are often just a collection of sayings without any stories at all. Stories, written from truth, offer historical details as evidence. These details should include things that can be verified, like locations and geography, seasons when things happen, festivals, plants, animals, and foods. These validate the story to those who know the locations, the cultures described, and they also give meaning to the story. For example, in the story of Jesus being taken to Mount Precipice to be killed for implying that God did not always act to benefit only Jews, that's Luke 4:16 through 30. When we actually go to the location, and I've been there, and when you get to the top, what you're actually looking at are the two mountains where the locations were of the examples he used when he was talking earlier in the synagogue about God not backing always the Jews. And so we see the story is set in a verifiable location that actually helps explain the story. They're stunned. He just walks through the crowd. We know the locations in the gospel are real and that the Jews really lived there during that period. The Gospel of Luke and Mark often describe specific geography that archaeologists can even use to find things like the synagogue at Capernaum or the Pool of Siloam, the pilgrims road into the Temple Mount, and Peter's house. We know the apostles lived in Galilee, and we know that the places where Jesus said he was were historical because they have evidence of ancient Jewish communities, and the cities were of the same name at the same place. We know from the sources outside the Bible that Jesus encountered real historical people like Pontius Pilate and Caiaphas that were hostile to him. And even more so, when we talk about the story of Paul, we know that Jesus was executed on the cross under the laws of the Roman government. And we know that from history hostile to the New Testament. We know these stories were so widespread, including a lot of the miracles, that the Roman government could not just simply deny they ever encountered anybody named Jesus. Some historians even see evidence of Roman cover ups of miracles, like building a temple to their God of resurrection at the very spot where the paralytic was healed in the pool of Bethesda. That's John 5 2. So while we do not need evidence of every fact, I certainly have no film of Jesus walking on water. True stories that want to be verifiable include enough facts that history can affirm them later. The point is that authors telling a true story write like witnesses, and apostles are witnesses by definition. Verifiable history is then strong evidence of apostolicity and a requirement of the motif of gospels. I have compiled a rather exhaustive list of all the alleged lost, hidden, or secret gospels through the centuries that I could find. I'll put a link in that to the YouTube video for this when I post it. The alleged gospels not accepted by the church, remember, are called non canonical. And yes, some of them were even written, you'll look on the list, as new revelations and gospels, supposedly, in the 20th century. That's a good reason as to why I would never trust an open canon. Let's take a look at a few of these and talk about whether they can meet the test to be Christian gospels or not, in order to understand why they're not included. Let me give you two examples just for fun. The first is the Gospel of Barnabas. It's one of my favorites because it's thrown up at me all the time by Muslims, and there's a good reason why. The book is actually sort of a wisdom book. It's just a bunch of sayings and some stories that actually sort of try to harmonize what the Christian Gospels say, but make Jesus appear to be more Islamic. It's probably written of Spanish or Italian origin, and it wasn't written until the 16th century and attributed to Barnabas, the one of the traveling companions of Paul in Acts. Of course, Barnabas probably died in 63 AD or so, so we hear nothing more about him after that. So the chances that he wrote a gospel in the 16th century are pretty miraculous. And look at the reasons rejected. I've got a code here, but basically it's that the apostle died beforehand. It says things that contradict the gospels that are already out there. There's just all kinds of reasons why this is not believable. but it's a good example of what we see. How many of you know the Fifth Dimension song, The Age of Aquarius? It's paired with a song called Let the Sunshine In. This is the dawning of the age of Aquarius. Yeah. So, did you think that might come from an alleged gospel? Well, maybe. Um, the Aquarian Gospel of Jesus Christ was actually written in 1908 by Lehi H. Dowling. And basically, he said he transcribed the book from old Akashic records. I'm assuming I'm pronouncing that right. And it was a new age spiritual revelation about constellations and astrology pointing towards an end time. And you can see there again, reasons rejected. There's just so many all over the place. This one doesn't even claim to be from an apostle, and yet it's supposed to be some sort of gospel of Jesus Christ. Anyway, I put play it again, Sam, there because as you go down these things, they get pretty silly in their claims. I just wanted to share that with you. We're going to put that document up where you can see the whole thing, and I'm going to keep building it out until I've got it complete. The book also talks about a theme called the theme of misunderstanding in John's gospel. And this is where Jesus uses illustrations that are spiritually illustrated, and people hear his words humanistically through their flesh rather than spiritually. This can be seen very clearly in John 3, where Jesus encounters Nicodemus, the being born again section, and then again in John 4, both when he talks to the woman at the well about living water and to the disciples about spiritual food later when he talks about the manna that God provided him in the desert. It's all over. It's most clearly explained in John 6, verses 60 through 65. And there Jesus says that he speaks in ways that those that his Father gives him can understand, meaning that if you've not been chosen by God the Father, you're not going to get the things that Jesus says. You just simply miss the point. So I haven't for sure decided to do this, so don't hold me to it. But I'm considering doing a deeper dive into the topic that is the elephant in the room. And that is that if we use these very sound means of coming up with what things are in the Bible, how is it that the Catholics, the Eastern Orthodox, and the Protestants all came up with a slightly different list of books? Does that refute everything that Kevin just said? Heads up, it doesn't. And then the follow up question to that would be okay, so if we don't agree on the same books, can we still consider ourselves all Christians? Or do we point fingers at each other and say, you're not sincere and you don't understand and you're a heretic? um, we shouldn't. So we can talk about that. I'll also compare that just so that we're all dealing from the same ground and we're not saying this one's true and this one's true and at each other. Let's talk about it in terms of something that the Christian faiths agree to, which compared to some modern churches that took completely modern things and decided that they were new revelations to be considered in Scripture. So I'll be doing that as a second study, hopefully, and I look forward to seeing if you want to get into that as well. If you do, by the way, put it in comments to this video when I publish it. Thank you. See you next time. Whew, that was a lot. Oh, I almost forgot. You haven't answered questions 3, 6, 7, 8, and 9. Let's do that in group now. You thought you were getting away with it, huh?